It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Science History Institute. I'm David Cole. I'm the president of the Science History Institute. And I want to say a special welcome to those of you who may be visiting us for the first time. How many people are here who, for the first time, never been to the Institute? Okay, great. Well, welcome again. Really pleased to have you here. If you're here for the first time, I want to tell you, if you don't already know, that the Science History Institute is a museum and a library. It's free to all, everything free. And we're dedicated to collecting, interpreting, and sharing engaging stories in the history of the chemical sciences and the life sciences. As part of our mission, we convene gatherings, such as this one, where people address the burning scientific and technological questions of the day through the lens of the history of science. We do this because we believe that an understanding of the past can empower people to make better decisions about the critical issues of the present and to build better futures. As you are well aware, climate change is an issue for which an informed historical perspective can be instrumental to making sense of present circumstances and to evaluating the choices that are available to us in the future. It is important, for example, to understand a little-known fact that in the 1970s, some oil executives promoted environmentalist positions and endorsed forecasts of limits to growth caused by resource scarcity. This phenomenon, in fact, is the subject of an important project we will be learning about and discussing this evening, entitled Managing Scarcity and Sustainability, the Oil Industry, Environmentalism, and Alternative Energy in the Age of Scarcity. This project is led by Professor Cyrus Modi and funded by the Dutch Research Council. Managing Scarcity and Sustainability explores a time when the oil industry was investing in alternative sources of energy production and thinking about energy transition issues. Together, the Managing Scarcity Project and the Science History Institute have co-organized a workshop in Paris, where our European office, operated by our Director for International Affairs, Brigitte Van Tiegelen, standing in the back, has been based since 2017. The workshop, entitled, quote, Science at the Crossroads, Intersections between Academic Research and Journalism on Energy, Environment, and Correcting the Scientific Record, unquote, has fostered intense conversations between journalists and historians on the challenges presented by sharing knowledge, as well as confronting rumors and ignorance around the intersection of energy and the environment. Today, as Cyrus will explain in a moment, we are building on those conversations, formulating important questions, and sharing them with you. To illustrate some of these key questions, our museum staff has prepared a little something for you. They've selected a number of board games to share, games that focus on issues of energy and environment in an entertaining way. And I just want to alert you to the fact that after we're done with the more formal part of the proceedings, if you haven't already had a chance to make your way back to the case exhibits just behind you and to enjoy a little sampling of these board games, I invite you to do so. One of our more interesting and quirky collections. For now, though, it is my great pleasure to introduce Cyrus Modi, Professor of the History of Science, Technology, and Innovation at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, who will moderate this evening's panel discussion. Dr. Modi is Principal Investigator of the Dutch Research Council project Managing Scarcity and Sustainability, and he is co-principal investigator of the European Research Council Synergy project called Nanobubbles. I want to hear more about that. He's the author of 3 books with the MIT Press on recent histories of science and technology, the last one of which is called The Squares, U.S. Physical and Engineering Scientists in the Long 1970s. This book was published just last year. We are especially delighted to have this opportunity to welcome Cyrus back to the Institute and to celebrate his leadership of this project, because he was one of our Kane Fellows, our Kane Research Fellows in 2004 and 2005, and then went on to become Program Manager in Nanotechnology and Innovation Studies at the Institute's Center for Contemporary History and Policy from 2005 to 2007. We are very pleased to have him back on the premises again, and I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Cyrus Modi.
Well, many thanks for that introduction, David, and many thanks to the Science History Institute for sponsoring both tonight's event and the workshop in Paris, and for being a very reliable and exciting partner for the Managing Scarcity Project. It's great to be back in Philadelphia, right? This is one of the world's leading regions, not just for history of science, technology, medicine, energy, environment, and on, but also for public engagement with those topics through cultural institutions like the Science History Institute. And it's really that blending of history and public engagement that is the center for tonight's event. So as David said, this event is co-sponsored by Science History Institute and the Managing Scarcity and Sustainability Project, which is funded by a 5-year grant from the NVO, which is usually translated as Dutch Research Council. In that project, I and my team, Odin Melstead, who's here tonight, and also 2 PhD candidates, Jelena Stankovic and Michiel Bron, we look at the oil industry's involvement in alternative energy, nuclear, solar, geothermal, biomass, wind, etc., during the 1970s. And then we also look at individual oil actors' involvement in the environmental debates of that era, including a few leaders in global discussions of climate change, environmental governance, resource scarcity, and sustainable development. Now, in writing the proposal for that grant, I kept noticing that many of the threads that I was interested in had already been picked up by journalists who were doing history, who were writing in the present about the 1970s and 1980s, and who in general were way out ahead of the academic literature. People like one of our speakers tonight, Neela Banerjee, but also people like Murtaza Hussain from The Intercept, Lauren Steffi, Suzanne Rust, and so on. The Netherlands, it turns out, is very strong in this kind of historical environmental journalism, with people like Jelmer Mommers, Jaap Thielbeke, Alexander Bönder, and Adi Scholte, similarly working these veins of history with a very public audience. The past few years have also seen a number of activists turn to history and to journalism in order to advance their environmental work. And probably best known here are people like Jeffrey Supran and Ben Franta, and the line of activist history that's more or less related to Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, and to the Exxon New and Shell New hashtags. So when it comes to oil and environment, Faulkner seems to be right. History isn't even past. In fact, it's still front page news. So then the question is, well, what can academic historians contribute to this? What is our role in this discussion, and what is the relationship between journalistic history and academic history, if indeed there is any distinction to be made? I think that's something our panelists will want to address. To start answering those questions, Managing Scarcity in partnership with Science History Institute and also the European Research Council funded Nanobubbles project, as David mentioned, we organized this 3-day workshop in Paris in November, where journalists and academics who are working on very similar topics around history of energy and environment, but also around issues of research integrity, fraud and error correction in the scientific system, really had a deep, deep conversation about the similarities and differences between our practices and the possible opportunities for mutual collaboration and critique. Today's event, therefore, represents a more public-facing and obviously more North American follow-on to that Paris meeting. So I'm honored to welcome to the stage 2 people who can speak to these questions better than almost anyone else. So first we have Neela Banerjee, currently Deputy Senior Supervising Climate Editor at National Public Radio, previously a reporter with New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Wall Street Journal. Most relevant to tonight's discussion is Neela's 5-year leadership of a project for Inside Climate News that brought to light Exxon's extensive climate research in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and its subsequent turn away from accurate acknowledgement of climate change. Some of you may be aware, for instance, of the A recent article in Science got lots of headlines in The Guardian and the New York Times and elsewhere by Jeffrey Supran, Naomi Oreskes, and Stefan Rahmstorff, synthesizing what's known of Exxon's efforts and just how accurate Exxon's predictions of climate change from the 1970s were in forecasting the situation today. But Neela and her team really, in many ways, were the ones who first broke that story, and academic historians like Naomi and myself have been following that, what Neela has done very, very closely. So that work has been incredibly inspiring, both for my own understanding of the past and also for finding ways to communicate my work to non-historians. Then alongside Neela, we have Paul Sabin, Randolph W. Townsend Jr. Professor of History and Professor of American Studies at Yale University, Neela's alma mater. He is the author of, among other things, Crude Politics, The California Oil Market, 1900 to 1940 from 2005. The Bet, Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon, and Our Gamble Over Earth's Future from 2013. Which is a history of a debate between two public intellectuals, so I think very much a rehearsal for tonight's event. And most recently, Public Citizens, the attack on big government and the remaking of American liberalism, which explores the environmentalist and leftist suspicions of the state that coexisted and sometimes interacted with right-wing small government activism in the 1960s and 1970s, and which continues to inform the caution with which the American state approaches climate change and other environmental issues. Paul's also a committed pedagogue with particular contributions to Yale's programs in environmental history and environmental humanities. And he is, as I say, a public intellectual, regularly writing essays for the Washington Post, The Atlantic, New York Times, Boston Globe, Slate, and so on. So to get started, Neela and Paul are going to give short pitches about how journalistic and academic histories of energy and environment can build on each other, but also maybe critique or speak past each other, and also maybe whether journalistic and academic histories is or should be a viable distinction, or whether we need to think in more fluid terms about histories written in a variety of modes and for a variety of audiences. So please, Neela.
So in the organizing email that Cyrus sent out, I have to go first, mainly because, we're the ones as journalists, I've always felt, who take, I often fear a more superficial approach to things, and we rely on historians to go deeper. So originally this talk was posed as like journalists versus historians, monsters versus aliens or something like that. And in fact, Paul and I, we were like, well, actually there's so much in common. And personally, I think among journalists, especially now, a great deal of respect for what historians do. I think all of us feel like we're historian light, that we just don't have the intellectual heft to do history. And I also think that journalists who don't bring an appreciation of history to the subjects that they cover, whether it's environment or politics or public health, are shortchanging their audience. When we were doing the Exxon project, we ended up relying on many of the resources that historians rely on, and also discovering new resources. So initially, and we can talk more later about how the Exxon project came together, and I'm trying to remember the progress here, but we found out that Exxon had a research and engineering arm. This was when Exxon was still based in New York City, and a lot of their activity was in New Jersey, and so they had this kind of blue sky research arm. And the man who ran it was a gentleman named Ed David, who'd actually been in the Nixon administration. So we found out that Ed had his archives at his personal papers at MIT, which is where he'd gone, I think, undergraduate and maybe graduate school too. So like any historian, we went there, and we went through his papers, which were mainly thank you notes. Right, thank you notes. Oh my gosh, it was so sort of it was stupefying. But occasionally you would come across something, and that discovery was, were these moments of delight which in turn pointed you in a particular direction. And what we came across was the name of a man named James Black, who was a scientist at Exxon Research and Engineering, who was very interested in climate change, and he'd been writing Ed David, his boss, about it even after he retired. So those were the initial steps that ultimately led us from those documents to people, and then the people led us to documents. And so this is, I'm kind of curious once we start talking about where we get the historical record, because what we found in a few years of working on Exxon's early work into understanding climate change, but also alternative energies, which were not really driven by climate concerns, but more by scarcity concerns, that there were people who had worked for Exxon and then had all of their research papers and at home. And, and we were like, blessed be the pack rats, because they provide us information. And they did, and there was this. And so, for example, what was lost in the shadow of the Exxon project was the fact that Exxon came up with, they had prototype electric vehicles that they actually tried to get Detroit to manufacture, and Detroit wasn't interested. One of their leading scientists, Stan Whittingham, came up with lithium-ion batteries. He won a Nobel Prize. People in science knew him, but we kind of stumbled across him and we interviewed him. And then a couple of years later, he won the Nobel Prize. And so one of the fascinating things about us was this whole progress to spaces that I think historians go to. And I'm also wondering whether in your travels, you also end up in people's personal archives, where some of the richest information is. But I don't see a conflict between what we do and what historians do, but rather, I think me as a journalist, rather a pursuit of the depth and nuance that historians bring, and a desire for our audiences to appreciate that. So I'll just hand off to you then.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me here. It's great to be part of this panel, and to just want to express my appreciation for the Science History Institute and its support of historical study of these topics. I've had students and colleagues who have come here, and I just want to emphasize how important it is to approach these areas of study from a historical perspective, which I guess is where I'm starting a little bit, is just exactly why bother taking a historical approach on energy and climate at all. Aren't these technical problems or economic problems or what have you? And so I guess I just, I often find myself as the lone humanist or historian in a room on campus trying to say yet again that actually this is a social problem, and it's interesting going back to Neil was saying about thinking about what was known in the late 1970s. Because actually there were some very interesting, not just Exxon's reports, but internal studies, but also government reports. Council on Environmental Quality issuing a report in 1981, or the National Research Council in 1979, basically saying, we've looked at this issue of carbon dioxide. We don't see any other explanation of what's going to happen. And they made projections, and those projections, were actually quite good. And so it raises the question, for us looking back at that now, 40 plus years, why hasn't more changed? And that is what brings me to the value of a historical perspective, because I think for so many of those 40 years, I think there was a real emphasis on the science and the technology and the economics of this. And without recognizing enough that it was really a social and cultural problem that involved ethics and justice and politics. And so I think a historical perspective really allows us to get a greater sense of understanding of the depth and complexity of the climate and energy problems that we face. And allows us to make sense of what's going on around us right now. And so I'll just put out one example of that would be the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. How do we explain why this law passed? And I think it's if you look at it in a larger historical perspective, you can actually get a lot of you can come to some understandings about that. Thinking about the change in focus from a stronger regulatory approach in the 1970s the critiques of industrial policy undertaken by the government, the turn towards market solutions with emissions trading or taxation strategies, and then you can follow that through. The Clinton eras, the failure of the BTU tax in 1994, for which the Clinton administration was badly punished. And all the way up to the cap and trade and tax struggles of the early 2000s. And I think what is interesting about that is when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act is to see how it's the culmination of all of those struggles over all those times. And so in some sense it's a new thing. But then at another level, it's the oldest American policy in the book, which is, if you go back and look at the history of American energy policy, it's mostly about distributing benefits, using the tax code to give encouragement, to subsidize various industries. It's about the American government as a distributing, encouraging all these different forms of technologies, and it's a return to the 40s and 50s and industrial policies and other types of subsidies. So I guess I just mentioned that as something that's in the air right now for us to think about, and the value of a historical perspective, and that a historical perspective also would help you, think about why different policies would have more or less success, why they would resonate, and there's a lot more to be said about the complexity of American energy policy that we could talk about, and thinking about the history is useful for that.
Just one thing about that too, about looking at things that are happening now and the history that it goes back to. I mean, sort of ways of thinking that you've seen in the past become applicable across disciplines or problems. And the clearest example for me was at the beginning of the pandemic, right? So we're in March and April 2020. And there are voices that are coming out with narratives that those of us who've looked at misinformation about climate change recognize immediately, right? That this is a hoax, that it is not that bad, that it was started in China, and it is about the government trying to control you. And not only were the narratives similar, like once we start to hear those narratives, they start to ping something in those of us who followed these narratives about climate change, but also once we dug a little deeper to find out where this came from. And social media really provides, a historical record. I mean, this kind of goes back to why are we looking at the president's tweets? I mean, it is a historical record, but it's a historical record of other things too. So people who were sort of promoting these narratives were the same people who had denied climate change as well. And the same people with whom these narratives were resonating were also the same demographics that denied climate change. So we saw, that the denial of climate change and the narratives that were used were the incubators for this kind of denial of COVID and the severity of it. And now, I was just talking to one of my reporters today, and it's sort of like, what do you do with all the misinformation that's out there, right? If there was misinformation about climate or tobacco, climate, and then COVID, for us as journalists, it is whack-a-mole. Every week, there is something that comes up that has to do with climate or with COVID, things that seem so tangential. But if you have a historical perspective, you understand the roots of this, and you understand that it is not happening in isolation, but that it is part of this trend that has moved and evolved in American society. And I think for those of us who, more than historians, are in closer communication with you as journalists, it is incumbent upon us to have that knowledge and to bring that nuance.
Oh, fantastic. Can we maybe make things a little bit concrete for our audience by talking a little bit about practice and process, right? So take us through, where does the idea for a story come from, right? And, why did you go look at Ed David's papers in the first place? Or why did you think, oh, I should write a book about Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich, right? And then collecting the data, writing it, putting it through peer or editorial review. Just kind of walk us through that a little bit.
Right, so we'd actually written about it, but Inside Climate has redone their website, so I don't know if the story of how we got the story is still on Inside Climate's website. So basically, the impetus for this was a little bit, was kind of out of history, or rather a case study in Harvard Business Review. So I don't know if that's history, but it's like somewhere in there. Anyway, but what happened was that Inside Climate has a virtual newsroom, right? So even before we all were working remotely, and once a year we used to get together and have a brainstorming session in person. And our founder and publisher had been reading Harvard Business Review, where there was a discussion of how scientists at the major European oil companies in the 90s were going to their executives and saying, look, human-driven climate change is real, it's like our product, and we got to do something about this. So David, in reading this sort of case study, came to our meeting with the reporters and said, well, if this is what the European fossil fuel companies knew, like what did American fossil fuel companies know? And here, obviously, it's a bigger playing field. Like some of the biggest coal companies in the world are here. And so we were not looking at Exxon originally. We were looking very broadly at all sorts of fossil fuel companies. And we were actually quite resistant as journalists to doing this. We were like, this is a needle in a haystack. Ain't nobody gonna talk to us. Like, where are we gonna find this? And he just kept pushing and pushing. So we were like, fine, we will go through the motions and whatever, we will appease you because you like pay our salary. And so what happened was that a colleague of mine did speak to somebody. I mean, there are people still alive who have this institutional knowledge. Stan Whittingham, when we spoke about the lithium-ion batteries, was in his late 80s. And a colleague of mine spoke to a scientist who'd worked with the energy department, who's, and they were just talking very broadly about what industry knew when. And so it's almost like taking an oral history of somebody who's hearkening back to the 80s. And he said, well, the leader in all of this was Exxon, right? So Exxon all of a sudden got elevated in our attention. And that's where, so we were going through the motions, trying to do what our boss asked us to do. And Exxon became more interesting because they were doing work not in the 1990s when the European climate scientists were, but in the 80s, right? And literally we stumbled upon Exxon's ambitious work through what you ask your students not to do, and that is procrastinate, right? So what happened was, it was like one evening, I was avoiding doing a story, and I started to go through the resources that we didn't have when I was a student, but now everybody has, and that's Google, right? So I was, I don't even know what I was looking, oh, I know what it was. Somebody sent me from this listserv that I was on of climate journalists, the fact that they had found a record of a congressional hearing in the late 1970s about climate change. And I was like, why are they talking about climate change in the 70s? It's like if we were talking about time travel now or something like that. So because Exxon had been elevated in our understanding, I started to look in this 500-page document, it was a PDF, and to search it for oil company names. The companies that existed back then. Nobody showed up. And as soon as I put in Exxon's name, a name showed up. And it was this man named Henry Shaw. And I started to Google Henry Shaw. And we came across this study where they had outfitted a supertanker with bespoke instruments to measure carbon dioxide in the water, in the ocean, and in the atmosphere as it plied its route from the Caribbean to the Persian Gulf and back. So we were using these resources that were available online. They weren't hidden. I mean, a lot of people try to say, well, Exxon hid this in a drawer. They didn't hide it. Like, we found it on Google. And so, but people weren't talking about it. We found out that Henry Shaw was dead. He had died in the early 2000s, but there were enough people who were alive and who were still in good health who could talk to us about them. Those people led us to documents. Those documents led us to more people. But it all came out of this case study, this historical case study, and just basic research. And one other thing I will say is that, is that once we got this trove of documents, one of the knocks against us by Exxon and other oil companies was Inside Climate, they're a bunch of activists and they cherry pick this stuff. First of all, we digitized the information and we shared it so people could read it. But the other thing too was that there were, in the documents that were found, there were doubts about what the climate science at the time, in the late 70s, early 80s, what the climate science was saying. So what we wanted to find out was, were these the kernels of the narrative of doubt that would emerge in the 1990s? Or was this the way people were thinking about climate change at that time? And so I think we took a step that maybe historians or academics would do to make sure that we were looking at this correctly. And so we found climate scientists from that era who'd worked with Exxon, and they're like, no, the doubts that Exxon had were the same doubts that we had. It's very much in the scientific mainstream. So that was the process. It was going from evidence to evidence, and then looking at our evidence and making sure that we understood it correctly.
That's great story. And I was thinking about what some of the differences might be between journalism and history, and one aspect has to do with writing more recent history versus writing what most of my colleagues do, which is things further back. And often those people have passed on, and you don't get a chance to interview them, and they don't get a chance to talk back at you, which has its own benefits. So you were asking about whether people go into people's houses. I mean, I've had those. I've certainly had those opportunities in writing about the 70s, because people. But the first book on oil in California, that was not really so much an option. I was thinking about how again, where history differs maybe. And one of the challenges of writing about things from within the context of the history profession, and one aspect of that is I think historians are motivated by things that are going on around them in the present, and that's part of where they get their questions and their interests, and of course we live in the present, and so that brings us, we have to care about it enough to want to write about it, and so it has to have some relevance. But we're also part of a conversation within an academic profession about a variety of different topics, and that can make it difficult that makes it challenging, because you have to find a topic that is intellectually new or has some edge in a broader scholarly conversation that may not just be the interest of the story itself, but the story has to also represent some larger theme about how what's the relationship between how do Americans think about government, or how's that changed over time, or and you've been talking about one of those themes, which would be thinking about climate science and what people knew and whether it was consistent. But I think that it can constrain historians, because sometimes there are issues that are very important for us to understand right now, and we need to have more stories about them, whether it might be the political power of various energy interests in American democracy, and how that plays out. The problem is that for historians, those stories are not as interesting anymore, because
Why isn't that interesting anymore?
I mean, they've been told. We know it. So it's hard. It's hard to. It can be challenging to write yet another book about, I don't know, Texas oil, money and power, and how that played out, and you have to find some angle on it that is new, as opposed to saying, oh, here's another oil company that also. Did such and such, and it becomes, you have to think of a new angle on it, or some angle on it that will allow you to be saying something about how we should think about history, and new ways of thinking about it. Because if you're just talking about the corporate power and how it's exercised in American democracy, that's vitally important for us all to understand, and there's a lot of clouding and mythologizing and misleading around that. But within the history profession, not so much. I mean, that's just an interesting dilemma, I guess I would say, that I've faced, because my first book was about oil in California, and it had a lot of those dimensions, but I couldn't. Doing a second book on exactly the same thing might have been worthy in some ways, but not in others.
But, isn't this a pressure that journalists also face?
Yes and no. And you know, I was a reporter for a really long time, and now the last 3 years I've been an editor, and it's given me a slightly different perspective. And I think part of it is that, you know, within your profession as a historian, or within your circle as a climate reporter, or even your desk, like our climate desk at NPR, you know, something happens and people are like, oh, everybody knows that. We've told that story so many times. And it's like, you might know it, but our audience, I guarantee you, our audience, which really, like, our audience by and large accepts that human-driven climate change is real, they don't know this, and we need to tell them because they are not immersed in this every day like you and I are. So there's a level of repetition that I think people find cumbersome as professionals, whether it's journalists or historians. And in fact, one of the great things about being a journalist is to rely on historians because you can bring nuance, opinion, depth to our stories, but you know, when we can give you a platform to talk about those things that maybe you're not going to be able to write a book about, but you feel like is worth saying. And you know, like the way power is deployed by corporations, I mean, we kind of think about it in broad terms, but this is a really interesting point right now, right? With the growing awareness among Americans that climate change is hitting them, that it is not a distant problem, right? With the fact that renewable energy is getting cheaper, with the fact that you have a younger generation of Americans who are just like not gonna put up with this stuff anymore and want change, there is a real threat that I think fossil fuel interests feel in a way that they haven't in a really, really long time. And there are various ways that narratives and power are being deployed right now that's just fascinating. And I think, you know, if you don't know the history of it, right, you're not bringing enough to the table as a journalist, you know, in reporting on this stuff. So yeah, sometimes it feels like you're saying the same thing over and over again. But I think if you think of journalism as providing a service to people or to the Republic, or however lofty or simple terms you want to bring to it, then you do have to repeat things, you know? It takes a minute for people to realize that something is real. And then from there you can build on it. So, you know, I mean, yeah, it's a problem, but I sort of feel like if it helps people understand, I'm okay with it.
So what are some of the things that we want our different audiences, whether that's academic historians or the general public or policymakers or thought leaders or whoever, what are some of the things we would like them to know about the history of energy and environment that inform the way they think about debates today? And what are some of the things that they might think are newsworthy about those topics?
Well, I think that's actually slightly more complicated to answer than it seems because of what history can offer to the present. And I think that sometimes what we want to take from the past, well, I guess I just want to bring us to the dilemmas of different kinds of narratives that you can tell about the past, and the lessons that they might have. And so we were talking about the story about corporate power and its relationship to our struggles to solve the climate problem. And that is a very important part of this history and challenge in trying to carry out any effective policy in the United States. But as a historian, if I'm trying to teach my students about this, you know, why haven't we solved the climate problem since, you know, the late 1970s, you know, that could be one way for me to narrate it. But it also seems maybe a little limited because there are a lot of other dimensions to that. You know, government also knew a lot about climate change and struggled to respond and didn't respond. Even when the American people in their various pockets knew things, there are a lot of other pressures, you know, related to economics and culture, and it's just an incredibly complicated issue that is extraordinarily difficult to solve. And I guess as a historian, I think in terms of I guess the question is, what are the stories that people need to know? On the one hand, maybe people need to know the story about corporate power. I think they do. But then you can also tell other stories that are more complicated, that show all, it has to do with American federalism, it has to do with changing attitudes towards the government, it has to do with with consumption, it has to do with ideas about science, not just the corruption or these problematic aspects of science, but also scientific certainty and how people think about, how they communicate about science. Anyway, it's complicated to think about, and you could develop different, I guess the point is you could develop different kinds of politics based on these different historical stories. One could be a politics that's very directed at the corporations and trying to target them for action. Another politics might be, I won't define it, but it could be a varied politics that is trying to bring all these different components in and develop some complicated interpretation that would think about all the different places that people are coming from and why it's so hard. So I guess so I'm giving you a bit of a fudgy answer to what the history is that people should know. I think they need to know both those stories, and both those stories are true. And part of what we do when we teach history is sort of wrestle with which one's more important and how we weigh the the implications of the different stories, if that makes sense.
So I think for us as journalists, sometimes, so I think one of the big differences obviously is even when you have something online, people will only consume so much on a screen, right? It's not a book. And so books, you don't have the room to go into a lot of history when you're writing an article. But a lot of it is that as a journalist, you should know the history so that you know the right questions to ask and the right way to approach a particular topic, right? So for example, like one of the things that we are seeing is that there has been a pivot among those actors in our society that want to slow or derail our transition away from fossil fuels to carbon-free energy, right? And it's now sort of passé to just, say that climate change is a hoax and the science is uncertain, blah, blah, blah. Instead, what we're noticing is that the attacks have moved to the attack on solutions. So, the Texas ice storm a couple of years ago, right? That it was because the windmills froze. That's actually not true, but that came out and it stuck in a lot of people's heads. The demise of SVB Bank, right? It's because, they invested in, because they had all of these climate startups that were their customers, when in fact that's, economist after expert has come out to say that's not true. But these narratives are coming out. And so you're not going to be able to go into the history of misinformation from these actors in your story because, people have limited, your expectation when you're reading a news article is different than your expectation when you're reading a book. You want to be in and out of there pretty quickly. But you, as a journalist, should know that this is part of this particular trend. And because of that, you know what to focus on and you know how to, and the questions to ask, right? And you know that this isn't just like something that's popping up here, popping up there, that this is part of a trend in our society to slow or derail action on climate change because it runs counter to various interests. And yeah, so that's how it informs our work. We don't necessarily bring it to all of the stories, but we try to bring it to our approach to stories.
Did you want to say something? Okay, yeah. So you mentioned questions a few times. So yeah, let me ask, what are some of the questions about energy and environment for which an historical perspective can help us answer those questions? And in particular, what are some of the questions that we haven't asked enough yet, right? So what should we be asking now?
I mean, I think, like, for example, with this whole idea of solutions, right, to decarbonize the economy, people are like, well, that makes sense, and people are making money off it, and there are businesses around it, so, like, it's all good, right? Like, we're just gonna move there. And you don't realize that there is constantly a backlash. There's constantly stuff that's happening. So I think the questions one should be asking is, how is this progress going, and how is it slowing? Like, so the IRA is being rolled out, right? A lot of the money is going to go to the states. So like among the things that we ask ourselves as journalists, we don't have answers to yet because it's still early days, is like, what if the money goes to a state where it is in their interest to derail the IRA, right? Because either ideologically they don't think climate change is real, or because they're politicians in that state who want to derail it because it looks good for their purposes. The flip side on solutions is that everybody and their sister is coming up with solutions for climate change. And so one of the things that we do as journalists is we try to make sure that solutions are sound. And so we try to help our audience navigate these ideas, right? And we've talked to historians. In fact, we just came out with a story like, you're hearing about solutions, what's real, what's not, and how can you tell? And so historians of science tell us, well, find out like who is putting out the solution and why, and then ask questions about these solutions. So I feel like our reliance on academics helps us frame things in a way that is not just, that's really useful for our audience. I mean, we're your proxy, right? Like they pay us to go talk to people like Paul, And then we bring Paul's information to you because it's like, it's bigger than the class that he teaches at Yale. And so, so those are the questions that we've come up with. And I can tell you that at NPR, we collect data on who reads our stories and listens to our stories. The three things that people, climate audience is interested in are clear explainers of science, especially with extreme weather. Atmospheric rivers in California. Is climate change behind that? And, and we have to say, we don't know. There's not enough science out there. This is, but at least we've given you an answer. And it might be that we don't know, but at least it kind of calms you down, right? Or I don't know if it calms you down, but it gives you some sense of reality. Like, we're not gonna lie to you. If there's no link, like it's not, we're not gonna say there is. The other two things, though, are accountability stories, right? And solution stories. People want help in navigating these competing realities that they are bombarded with. And for us to do that, we look at what's happening, we ask questions, and the questions are informed by history, by tying things together and saying, aha, like that's what's happening, or these things are popping because like they're not isolated, they're part of a bigger trend. So that's kind of, part of it. I mean, also, I'm not going to tell you all the questions we ask because those are our story ideas.
So historians love finding something that somebody hasn't looked, no one else has looked at. So your discovery of these archives is great opportunities. And when new archives open up, everyone wants to be the first one in to find out what's there. And actually, also with the passage of time, it's almost as if new archives open up because all of a sudden, I don't know, 70s becomes history, or people are now writing about the 80s and the 90s, starting to think about that in history departments, which is can get shocking, but interesting. And so, someone recently wrote a reinterpretation of the Clinton administration from a historical perspective. I think that historians also are drawn to writing things that will change how you think about something, so that will lead you to think about it in a new light, or a different way. And people jokingly talking about moving the furniture. It's a very much oriented around a faculty meeting where the chairs are all in one place, and someone's come in and they move the furniture. But they've changed the landscape so that you look at it in a new way. And sometimes that's in response to things that are going on that shape how we look back at something. Something that I've been noticing that I'll just bring up maybe related to the Inflation Reduction Act too, which is on everybody's mind these days. Has to do with how people look back at the 1960s and the 1970s and the passage of environmental legislation from that time. And there's been a lot of commentary more recently about some of the landmark founding environmental legislation of the early 1970s, particularly the National Environmental Policy Act and its requirements for environmental review. And these were held up as this was the foundational environmental law, environmental charter for the nation, et cetera. And more recently, there have been interesting critiques of that law from liberals and the left, talking about how it has made it more difficult for the government to do things. And so this is interesting, and people are starting to write about that. And it's connected to political movements that are going on right now. In California, there's something called the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard, which is about criticizing what's happening, how hard it is to build housing, how hard it is to build transit, how hard it is to site renewable energy infrastructure. And the culprit in this story are all these veto points along the way that make it difficult to do public projects and create public goods, even in a largely liberal state such as California. And what I think is interesting about that from the perspective of writing history and asking questions is that it is, at its root, is a reinterpretation of the sort of 1960s and 70s period when the kind of coming out of the World War II period, built the interstates, had urban renewal. We sprayed pesticides all over the place. We were testing atomic weapons. All these things that the government was doing, without any environmental review or social review. So then you had people like Robert Caro, writing The Power Broker about Robert Moses and how terrible it was that people were wielding public power in these ways. So that was that critique, and that's where NEPA and these environmental laws that are making it difficult, that's where that came from. And now we're in this time where people want to build, a lot of people want to build things. The Inflation Reduction Act is all about building things. The infrastructure law, we got to build all these things. And so they're going back and they're like, maybe this was a little different. Maybe this was not quite what we thought it was, and maybe we need to reinterpret this legacy and think about the complexity of it. And I think that is, I said people like to have a new angle on something. That is the current angle that's developing right now, of going back and looking at this. I was reading articles. Public participation in the 1970s, good. Public meetings, civic participation. Public participation right now, that's why that's who's blocking the housing. That's who's fighting the thing. This and that. There's a lot. It's just very interesting reversals, and I think at least interesting historical questions, about that.
So one interesting thing you were talking about, rearranging the chairs and rearranging the furniture, right? But part of it is that I feel like a certain discovery or a certain change can often prompt questions that make documents, evidence, people more relevant than they were before. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that. After we did the Exxon project, we found out that there was an environmental lawyer who was, he independent of us, was also asking the same questions. Like, when did the American fossil fuel industry know about climate change? What were their scientists telling their executives, right? And what he found out was that before there was the American Petroleum Institute existed then. Basically in the late 1940s, there was this committee on the American Petroleum Institute called the Smoke and Fumes Committee. And it was because smog in Southern California had gotten really, really bad. And there was a push, the initial push to regulate air quality was coming from there. So, so they gave us this tip. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And I don't quite know how I came to this, but I found out that the American Petroleum Institute, the API's, records, their minutes of meetings from the 40s and 50s were at the Library of Congress, right? So I went to the Library of Congress. It's sitting in plain, it's not in a vault, right? Like you just go and they bring it out. And all of a sudden, you start reading this stuff, and it has this enormous relevance, because what we discovered was that the casting of doubt on science, the desire to delay action, right, was not something that the tobacco industry came up with or that the oil and gas industry came up with on climate in the 90s, right? This was something that had its roots in the 40s and 50s, and there was even a scientist whom the oil and gas industry went after, who had discovered what was behind smog, right? He was a chemist at Caltech. So all of these documents had been lying around, but because people were asking different questions, all of this became relevant. And the questions we asked, as I explained to you, they arose from the Harvard Business Review article that David Sassoon read, but also like the fact that Exxon had funded organizations that promulgated these narratives of doubt in climate science as the climate science was growing more certain, that was work that environmentalists at Greenpeace had done looking at public records. They had looked at tax records of the organizations that had either given money, the foundations, or that had gotten money, which were nonprofits, right? They also looked at, so we were standing on the shoulders of others, you know, to be able to ask these questions, to be kind of interested in Exxon and what they'd done. And at the same time, once we asked those questions, the smoke and fume stuff became more interesting. People in the Netherlands started to look at Shell. And now a lot of us look at other things too. So the second example I wanted to give you is this whole kerfuffle over gas stoves, right? I own a gas stove too, came with my house, I don't know what to do with it, but anyway, so this whole kerfuffle around gas stoves, are they bad for you? Do they affect health, right? So we had actually looked at this before everything kind of blew up in January. We looked at this in October of 2021, and for a number of reasons. And the reporter who looked at it came across, I mean, this is how research goes. Like you come across something and there's like a mention of a paper, and then you go to that paper and there's a mention of another paper. And what he did was a story that came to fruition that, you know, we decided to pull the trigger on when this whole dust up was occurring in like February or so. And it basically said that the gas industry had developed a burner that would let you burn less gas, so it'd save you money on your gas bill, and it would burn more cleanly, and it just, you know, does its job just fine, helps you cook your food. And they developed this like in the 70s, you know, so now like the perspective that we brought, that journalists all over the world have brought to looking at what industry knew and when they knew it, right, is something that a lot of journalists do now. And somebody also had done something on Ford as well, this Maxine Joselo, who is now at the Washington Post. So those questions get asked because one of the things that we understood is that industry, especially in the 70s, like the 60s and 70s, you know, like so many of them wanted to have like their version of Bell Labs, right? To do this blue sky iconic work. And so those papers are out there, and it, you know, it's one thing for the gas industry to say, oh my gosh, we didn't know that, you know, nitrous oxides can harm human health or whatever, but it's like, who knew? It's like, well, you knew, you know, and here's the research. So that's why, you know, this kind of like, that research is also hiding in plain sight. It's there, it's just that nobody had asked those questions before. So I think all of, like, it's a constant conversation, whether it's among journalists and historians and social scientists, but, you know, people do work. You don't do your work in isolation, right? Somebody does work and it makes you ask questions, and then they do something, you know, and then your work makes them ask questions, and you know, and hopefully you reveal more to regular people so that they can make informed decisions.
So this example of finding these documents about this smoke and fumes committee, and suddenly they have a different meaning. I think that's a nice example of something academic historians are always trying to get across, which is that you know, things have a history, right? That even if they look the same, you know, they took place in a different context. You know, the past is a different place, and also they've changed over time. One of the things that can be historicized that way is telling histories of energy and environment itself, right? So how has, you know, our practice as people telling these histories, how has that changed, you know, particularly over the past 10 years or so?
Well, just sort of like what I said with like the way we journalists function now. And we're all, you know, so there's a bunch of lawsuits based on the Exxon papers, and we are just waiting for discovery, right? Like we just want to see, like, because there was a pivot point in Exxon's corporate history that nobody really knows why it occurred, and we hope to get some insights into that, you know. And it's not about like, you know, you're a villain. It's more like, why are we where we are? So yes, so that's definitely one of the things that's changed in journalism.
Yeah, and discovery is a great. Lawsuits are great for historians, at least when they don't get
Great.
settled privately,
So great,
and
lawsuits.
and the records are hidden away. But the you know, those records are often one of the only ways to get inside a, you know, corporate inside the corporate corporation. Actually, there's a wonderful website that exists if you like looking at documents. It's called Toxic Docs. And it has just aggregated all these documents from litigation over, asbestos and lead and all sorts of various toxic things.
Painkillers.
Yeah, and it's all on the web. Millions of pages of discovery. And then I think there's another website that's climate documents. Climate documents that also can
Yeah.
be if you can't sleep, you want to go look at documents. I think well, this is a broad-ranging question about how history is changing, but one thing that I think is interesting to highlight is the way people are now trying to reinterpret modernity in the last couple hundred years through the lens of energy, and to try to think about it as rethink it as a moment in time that has been profoundly shaped by energy systems. And that it should be the rise of democracy connected to coal, the thinking about mobility and transportation and how that's connected to energy systems, other ways. And some people have come up with there's a new term people are throwing around about the Anthropocene and kind of reimagining, our modern era as a period of time which humans are shaping the Earth, and that's connected to geology too, but is being used as a metaphor and a lens for thinking about more recent times. But I think we're seeing a lot of very interesting approaches to writing history that also break down some of the temporal categories, moving away from maybe more traditional landmark events, a war, an election, to thinking about big changes in energy systems and economic practices that might allow us to kind of to reimagine our recent human history as being profoundly shaped by fossil fuels. We live in this age of fossil fuels, and that then allows us also to imagine a future that might be shaped differently. If we understand this period of having been shaped in that way, then we can think about how energy systems shape social systems and political systems, and try to reimagine them as well.
And there's also a history that's felt in communities, right, that have developed fossil fuels. Like one of the best stories I remember that was written like in the New York Times, this was a while ago, might have been under Obama, and it was about how, there are a lot of reasons that coal-producing areas are reluctant to give up that industry. But one of the things that gets overlooked that feels a little bit squishy, but it isn't to the people who live there, is that it's part of people's identity, right? Like this is what we do. We power the country. We get these things out of the ground. We get these things out of the sea. And so it's this kind of felt history in families. It's sort of something that I think we ignore at our own peril. So yeah.
So one last question before we move to questions from the audience, and that's that a little bit implicit in your answer, Neela, about lawsuits and so forth, is that these histories are becoming more contentious and a little bit more polarized, right? So how should we craft our histories, our stories in that kind of changing environment?
Well, I mean, the lawsuits are just, the fact that there are various parts of the country that are relying on their local laws and the documents we found and others have found as the premise to sue fossil fuel companies. So that in itself is something we as journalists, we just report on. Like we don't really have, the only interest we have is that if there is discovery, that we get more insights into what happened, right? That got us to this point, but we just report them as news stories. But one interesting thing I will say is that, as newsrooms shrink, or as things like, say, climate become more important, and that, this notion of being sort of a lone wolf going out there and finding things, that's just not right. Like collaboration among journalists is the name of the game, but it's also, you're seeing collaborations between journalists and academics, right? And a reliance on them not just as sources of information and understanding, but especially in the sciences, you're seeing, climate journalists, for example, there was a great project that was done out of California where Stanford looked at where wildfire smoke went around in the country and like to the zip code level. So even here in Pennsylvania that, you had days that were affected and air quality that was affected by wildfire smoke out west, right? And that was a collaboration done by public media in California with Stanford. And so I think, whether it's sciences, social science, or history, people, especially this younger generation of journalists, I think sense the opportunity to collaborate, right? And because that gives, kind of richer information to our audiences. So that's what I think is happening. The lawsuits are just news, but everything else, like the actual way we do things, I think is shifting to a more collaborative mode, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, okay. All right, let's open it up to the audience. So down here, please. Someone will come down with the microphone for you.
Let's have a round of applause for our panelists, please. Thank you so much.
Just speaking. Yeah, so you have to remember in the 70s, the price of gasoline, the price of oil went, what, from 30 cents a gallon to $1.30 because of the Arab oil embargo. And overnight, people started buying smaller cars and using carpools. And therefore, the amount of CO2 per mile went down by a factor of 3. And now the price of gasoline is historically low compared to inflation. So why are we not trying to convince people to conserve carpools? And
I think that's a great question, and I think that it is part of my campaign for history to be studied, is try to make sense of that. Why do people drive such large cars? How has that developed? I mean, and it has, some of it is popular culture, and American consumption patterns and things like that. But also, it's very interestingly, if you go back and study it, is also public policy. Exclusions of light trucks and from mileage requirements and.
it's the price of gasoline is too low. All you have to do is tax it, raise the price of gasoline,
This is
and
America,
people will go
that's
to.
not gonna happen.
Okay.
No, I mean, I agree with you, but yeah.
But those
Okay,
are-
I
but
did
that's
work
also a
for an
historical-
oil company for 3/8 of a century, but when you tax gasoline, the money doesn't go to the oil company, does it? It goes to the government,
Right.
which could be used for public transportation, for example.
But I think that, again, is another area where it's interesting to like.
It's the only way you can get people to conserve, raise the price.
Right.
Moral imperative is totally useless. You can tell them these stories as you do in this speech, but if you raise the price of gasoline, people will go carpools and buy smaller cars and so on. How's that for us?
All right, let's hear some other questions. Thanks.
Take it away before I go crazy.
Thank you. It sounded like there's somewhat of a parallel between Exxon doing research and probably stopping because they knew the harm they were doing, and Big Pharma with the opioid crisis. Could you comment on that? And then I have another question.
Sure. So people like to draw parallels mainly between Exxon and the tobacco industry. And I'll tell you what the black box is, right? Like we talked to people who worked at Exxon and then ultimately left, and because the climate research. It's ExxonMobil now, but at that time it was Exxon. So in the 1980s. And basically what happened was that, from what they told us, is that, in the early 80s, the bottom fell out from the price of oil, right? And Exxon and other oil companies were making cutbacks, and scientific research was one of them. And so by the mid 80s, like 85, 86, these blue sky, ambitious science, research departments had really, really shrunk. So at that point, you didn't see like, aha, we're harming the atmosphere, and therefore we need to shut this down. That's not the impression we got at all, right? And in fact, what we found out from people as we talked to them who had not spoken to each other in decades, right? And we'd seen these documents and we went to them and we're like, what are we to make of this? And they said to a man, and it was all men, to a man, they said, it is because Exxon knew that there was going to be a policy response to what they were producing, and they wanted to do credible science to have a seat at the table and be taken seriously. That was the approach. And the black box is in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a response that was forming in not just the American government, but internationally to greenhouse gas emissions. And by the early 90s, Exxon had pivoted to leading, to sort of fostering this environment where doubt was where the science that they had supported and accepted years ago was doubted. That is what we don't know, right? That is like when I talk about discovery, it is this period from like 87 to 91. What happened then? Because we have documents up till then, and then there are documents that the LA Times and others found at Exxon's archives in Canada and in Texas. But it's this period where we just don't know what happened. So that's why I can't tell you if it's like opioids, right? I can just tell you up to that point, and that it looked like it was mainly financial.
Thank you. My second question is, why do you think there's a reluctance to move to clean energy like nuclear power? There's over 400 power plants in the world, and it seems like people are hanging on to 2011 and 1986 of Fukushima and Chernobyl.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there is a lot of history to be studied about people's attitudes towards nuclear, and it goes back even earlier to the legacy of nuclear weapons and atmospheric testing and fallout, and the sense of whether the government can be trusted around nuclear issues, and that leads into the 1970s and real concerns about the science and the technology and ways in which it was used, and then you have, of course, 3 Mile Island, and then later Chernobyl. And you have, but it's also more complicated than that as well, as historians like to say, which is, has to do with costs and inflation and things like that, where, you've been projecting out nuclear power plants over, multiple decades, and there have been cases in which investments in those plants have not turned out so well and had been pushed onto the ratepayers, and there's been a lot of controversy around that. And I think that there are questions, if you look also at simultaneously at what's been happening with the costs of renewables and the plummeting price of solar and wind. I think there's some questions right now about like what will the cost horizon look like in 20 to 30 years. So there's one question about whether you leave nuclear plants open that are currently functional. Another is whether you launch a 30 to 40 year project in the context of declining prices. I think there's been a lot of return to nuclear. Some people are calling for a return to nuclear now as a clean base load power. And new nuclear models. So I think this is a very live issue, and a lot of experimentation and discussion, debate that's going on around it. But I think that putting it in a historical perspective is probably the best way to understand what happened with nuclear and what some of the issues are. And that's kind of what I try to say, like when you study history, part of what you learn, like who are the different characters, what are the different issues. This is one way to understand, what those debates might be, regardless of what side you might end up on.
There was a hand right back here, a couple rows back from our last questioner, right?
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I want to thank both of you for your work. I'm a historian, and Paul and Neela, both of your work has been really influential in my work. I'm putting together a book on Exxon's environmental history. Hopefully it'll come out next year. And Neela, thank you so much. Like so much of your work is like an entire chapter in my book. So thank you. But what I want to say is, in the process of my career, one of the things that I've learned is there's just so much room for growth in the ways that journalists and historians approach topics. And I'm wondering, from your perspectives, what are the things that we can do to encourage people to see the connections between journalism and history as fields? I think that, especially for students, and some of the students that I teach, like, they don't necessarily know what historians do, but they know what journalists do. So like I have them think about doing history projects as like doing journalism. So I'm wondering from your perspectives, What can we do to encourage people to see the connections between history and journalism? And how can we strengthen what we all do by seeing these two fields as working together rather than competing for airtime? Thank you.
Okay, I'll take a crack at it. I mean, I think, part of it is sort of what I've been saying is that I think to be a better journalist, you have to have a depth of knowledge in various things, and including in the history of what you're reporting on. And so, like, a prime example is, like, what is happening now with SVB and other banks, right? Well, it's quite recent history where Dodd-Frank was changed to, increase like, rather than stress tests happening at what, 50 billion, like you have to have like 250 billion in assets. I mean, if you're not reporting on that, if you're not giving that context of what kind of set up this situation, then you're doing your audience a disservice. So it could even be recent history, but it's what we journalists like to call context, but really it's history, And so I think it's incumbent upon us, if we are in the older generation, as editors, as teachers, as professors, to require that what you're not reporting on is what's happening today, right? Like the back and forth. But what you're reporting on is like how we got to today, right? That is what people really want to know. Like because they read this and they're like, why? Why did this happen? And if you're not getting to the why, then why are you doing this? And I think a lot of journalism that is really glamorous and sexy and valorized in our society is basically sports, right? It's like, politics, it's like, this person landed a blow and this person landed a blow, and today, Nancy Pelosi's winning and tomorrow Kevin McCarthy's winning. It's like, but the history behind, so policy, so one of the interesting things is like, things that are like less sexy, like climate, for example. There are a lot of women journalists in climate because it was considered like not sexy. Policy is boring, who cares, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of us are involved in this because it lets us go deeper. And I think that really, it's about your audience, as if you're a journalist, is always asking why. Okay, yes, what happened? And then their next question is like, well, why did it happen? And if you can't answer that question, then you're not doing your job. So, and that's where history, context, data, science, peer review, all of that come into play.
I mean, from the history side, I think that there are a lot of great things about the professionalization of history over time, and it becoming more sophisticated and more accountable to itself. But I think it did result in some isolation of historians from popular debates about historical issues and a ceding of the territory, and that also plays out within the training of historians in graduate schools in terms of who they think their audience needs to be and what kinds of arguments they need to make and what kind of skills they need to develop. I actually think that that's changed in recent years, and there's more emphasis on public communications, a broader audience, trying to do crossover books that might be both an academic and a trade audience. So I think a lot of good things. But I can remember, when I was in graduate school years ago, that there was a historian wrote this very popular book that got a lot of attention in the American West and really stirred things up. And I remember talking, just the sense among graduate students and the way we were being communicated, like she just sort of it was just like too popular, and it was like too simplistic in some way. Actually, I gone back and looked, it's a very accountable book, a lot of sources, it was a great book. But I'm just describing the culture of being trained as a historian, and that was my own experience of it. I personally have been trying to encourage, trying to do it myself and encourage others to do this, but it's challenging. And I guess the other thing just to say is there are actual skills. I don't know if I've shown any of them tonight, but there are actual skills in being able to talk to people and try to explain things, and those are things that we need to honor and respect and try to encourage.
And I think if we're talking amongst ourselves, right, and whether journalists talk amongst themselves about like, who's winning or losing in politics, or historians or climate scientists, right, talking amongst themselves about, what's really happening in the West Antarctic ice shelf, what you do is that you diminish the importance of expertise to the rest of our society. I mean, look at what's happened with COVID, right? Like, well, I've done research, and therefore, my facts are as important as, like, the 20 years of experience that you have in a lab or something. So I think that we have been seeing as climate journalists, for example, that climate scientists, especially the younger generation of climate scientists, they realize the facts are just not enough. They need narratives, they need to tell stories, they need to go beyond the communities that they're in to reach regular people and to reestablish the value of expertise, right? And I think, all of us have to do that, and historians are just crucial for that. And we have been seeing it, in recent years. Social media, for all of its faults, also has become a platform for historians, tenured historians in various places, to give context or to call out, BS and misinformation that's on social media. Podcasts are another way where historians give backstories to things that are happening. So I think it's that to our peril, we have ceded like sort of popular culture to others and kind of look down our noses at it. And now there's a lot of ground that we have to make up, those of us who have skills in these areas.
I encourage everyone who's interested in this conversation to visit managingscarcity.com to follow the project. There's lots more wonderful work where this came from. And for any of you who are new to the Science History Institute, we also, speaking of podcasts, speaking of web content, online magazine, I love the point about bringing back that attention to expertise and bringing those voices into the room. So thank you everyone so much, and thanks for being part of the conversation tonight.